All right, I'm here with Shannon Beer. I think this is maybe the fifth time that we've recorded a podcast together, but this is now the new Beyond the Mirror podcast. And so, Shannon, it's great to have you here on this new and updated format.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Tell us a bit about yourself, Shannon. What do you do? Where are you? At this time of the year.
This time I'm in Bali for now, hopefully moving to Portugal, we will see. But I am a health and confidence coach who actually helps other coaches to pioneer change by engaging in their intentional personal development and improving their clients' body image, compassion, and self-confidence. And I think we're very much aligned in some of the things that we do. We sort of spotted some holes, some massively unexamined assumptions in the fitness industry and dove a little bit deeper into the evidence and now are committed to doing something that's actually helpful for people.
Nice. Yeah, and things that we'll talk about a lot in today's show, particularly this whole sort of like flexible dieting. Is it actually flexible? Is it actually rigid? And all of that kind of almost what's coming out now in the research for what were very new terms and methods really for a long time. Like we were like, oh, look at all these revolutionary methods, and actually it was still quite new. And I think now we're seeing long-term human research with these things. It's coming out to be like, is it actually that helpful? So let's talk about Restraint first off, because you've written this great article about, if it fits your macros and tracking calories and all the rest of it. And is it the best way to promote healthy behaviors? But what is dietary restraint? Like what would you define that as first off?
So dietary restraint just refers to the intention to restrict our food intake in order to prevent weight gain or to promote weight loss. So this would be the reason why we have clients who are like, I'm really trying hard and I'm not seeing results, because they probably have very high levels of dietary restraint, but that doesn't necessarily reflect caloric intake. So your restraint can be high without that influencing your eating behaviors, or more likely influencing your eating behaviors in a way that isn't actually helping you to reach your goals. So that can explain why it feels like someone is putting a lot of effort in, even if they aren't seeing the results that they're after.
Makes total sense. And then with that being the case, you've got this idea of like, okay, I'm trying really hard, but it's not bringing about the same results that they might like. And I guess, are we talking then about, this is when they're trying so hard to be so strict that actually like it's backfiring on them, that they're actually, having all or nothing approach with regards to either being like really, really strict or going on sort of subjective overeating episodes, that sort of thing?
Yeah, that can explain a large part of it, where we're very conscious about our food intake. We may be, depending on the style of dietary restraint that we're engaging in, we may be cutting out certain foods or trying to avoid or limit certain foods, which can then result in more preoccupation with food and more temptation. And like you say, at some point, that restraint gets very difficult to continue to uphold. And then we're more likely to end up overeating because we're feeling restricted. I think a large part of it as well is related to our reasons for wanting to manage our diet in the first place. So whether we're doing it because we're very conscious about our health, which isn't always the best motivator either, that can go too far as well. But that could be one thing, or it could be an attempt to change our physiques, or most likely in the real world, a little bit of everything. There are multiple reasons that we may be wanting to change our diets. It's really important to examine those reasons as well as the way in which we go about it. And we, as fitness practitioners, I think we've mostly been looking at dietary restraint as the only option. We've either got the rigid side or the flexible side, and that's the only way that we can make nutrition changes. Yet what you've been referring to as, the newer sort of styles of eating that we're seeing emerge, one of those being intuitive eating, that is not a form of dietary restraint. And yet it is another way in which we can approach our nutrition. So dietary restraint is not the only option that we have, and as we'll probably get onto, may not be the most helpful.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And you know, what you said there about the kind of intention behind the decision being very important, whether it's like a health-based change, whether it's like specifically for physique-based changes, and how closely you are monitoring those changes or attached to the outcome of those changes can affect then that like level of restraint you are feeling. If you're like only wanting to see the scale go down and then it's not going down, and you're kind of getting obsessed with those fluctuations, and you're getting so obsessed then with making your food like as perfect as possible, or consistently trying to hit your macros like bang on every time. It's like, even though you've tried to be flexible with the food choices or the like variety of food that you're choosing compared to a strict meal plan, it's still becoming very much restraint based because of the level of subjective effort that's going into it. And as you even said, then it's that whole, you might then become much more obsessed with certain foods, which might lead to less control around those foods. And I think that's the biggest thing that kind of blows people's minds, is when they're working with me and they're like, I really can't, like, I can't stop eating chocolate, or I can't stop eating sweets, like I can't stop eating junk food. But it's because they're trying so much to like ban those foods or limit those foods that in turn it's having the opposite effect that they would like.
Exactly. And yet, if we allow ourselves permission to eat those foods, funnily enough, we habituate to them and they
Mm,
lose much of their allure. So they are
mm,
less tempting because we know that we can have them if we want them. And we get to
mm,
question what it is that we really want. Because most people will find, if that, like the common fear being, well, if I give myself permission to eat, then I'll just eat shit and I'll eat that all the time and then I'll spiral and blah, blah, blah. You can
mm,
understand where those concerns come from, because someone may have given themselves permission to eat in the past, but it's never really unconditional. There's always, okay, if I track my macros, I can have that chocolate, but I'm only allowed one square. Well, that's not
mm.
unconditional then, because there are limits
No.
on that. Whereas unconditional permission to eat is not about, going all out. It's more about staying connected to the eating experience and
Yes.
knowing that there is a place for everything in the context of an overall health promoting diet, and no foods need to be banned. And as well, we're allowed to just enjoy food. That is
Yeah.
something that we can give ourselves permission to just eat something, not because we're hungry, but because
Mm,
it is enjoyable. And what
mhm.
we find is that you end up becoming a lot more relaxed and connected to your body. And that brings you back to the point where, if we just constantly ate foods that were very nutrient devoid, well, our digestive system wouldn't feel very great. We'd probably feel lacking in energy. When
Mhm.
you've overdone it and you know that, it doesn't feel good. Aside from the guilt that people feel, which is one thing, but even in the body, you don't feel that great. And we do require nutrients to feel our best. So
Mhm.
that really does address the concern of letting yourself go. It's like, well, no, because it's about staying connected to that and finding a pattern of eating that does allow you to feel your best. So I think for a lot of people, in order for them to fully give themselves unconditional permission to eat, it helps to have other strategies for how to cope with emotions as well, because that's the other
Mm,
sort of side of the coin. I think is when people don't have those strategies, food
mhm.
fills that gap, and then the thought of giving yourself unconditional permission to eat is totally out of the picture, because somebody already feels out of control. And that's an
Yeah.
obstacle that we face, I think, as coaches, to help people overcome that.
Oh, massively, yeah. Because I think that's the biggest kickback I get on a daily basis about intuitive eating, is that whole like, yeah, but I can't just like eat all those things all of the time. And I'm like, that's exactly not what I'm saying to do. But it's just the fact that you have to have that permission at first, because otherwise it will still feel like you are out of control or unable to limit these foods. And I know that it's scary from like a personal experience, because people are so afraid of weight gain. People are so petrified about seeing the scale go in the opposite direction that they've tried so hard to go for. And something we'll talk about that we chatted about before on air is like the whole, who's trying to lose weight, and how much is that actually going to have a positive effect, health wise, psychologically, and all the rest of it in the community that we work with. But because people are so afraid of weight gain, and they've been using these flexible dieting, which have actually become rigid dieting strategies to try and force that number down, they're like, no, well, I can't have unconditional permission to eat, mini egg cakes, because otherwise I'll go over my calories, like I'll be overeating. And it's and you can understand that fear, but then when you say it out loud, it's like, it's such a subjective term. It's like you're saying overeating and over your calories, but like, over what calories? Like, why have you defined those calories for yourself? Where does that come from? Like, how do you know that is overeating, or what your body needs in that moment? And it's interesting how you said, oh, I'll just have like one square, because I've had that exact same thing with clients. Oh, well, I bought these snacks because I thought to myself, well, if I have one of those like cake bars a day, that'll be fine. But then I still ended up eating more than them. And I said to them, it's because you were still restricting them. Like, it was still restricting. But it's such a fear factor to say, right, I am going to give myself this utmost permission to have what I want in the amount that I want, and trust the process of habituation. Because when you've done rigid dieting for so long, at first, that amount is more than you might like or feel comfortable with. So it can be a very scary process for people.
Absolutely. I think it's really important to acknowledge that, because, as you say, if you've restricted foods for a very long time, then you are likely, or it may be the case, that you do feel like you've gone too far for what feels comfortable for you when you start reintroducing them, which is why I think like gradual exposure to begin with can be helpful, whereby you do choose one food maybe that is less sort of fear inducing than other foods. So it could be, I even worked with a client once who wouldn't eat carrots because they were too high carb for a vegetable. That was the level of restraint that she was engaging in. And over time, we got to the place where she was having scones, because she was a baker as well, but never got to taste her own creations, because that's totally off the table. And yet I love making them for other people, and it was an amazing journey, really, because gradually over time, we began to introduce, the vegetables that would be considered high carb. Oh, you can have a whole banana, not just half a banana, things like that, in gradual steps, so that it wasn't totally overwhelming. But then when you do that, you gain a little bit of confidence, because you realize that, oh, okay, you know what, like, this is possible. I am able to control myself, because that's I think a belief that a lot of people internalize, is I'm just totally out of control. When it comes to these foods, I'm out of control. I'm the problem. So the only solution is just to get rid of them totally. And of course, that never lasts, for long, because that's not a way to live your life. And it's not necessary either. And then there's that resentment towards other people who can seemingly, have a plate of food in front of them and not be that bothered. I was like, oh, okay, well, I'll eat, and, I'll dip in and out of this meal, and I'll wait till I'm comfortably full. Whereas for those who are very high in restraint, it's like, how have you not finished that yet? There's a whole pizza there. How have you not just eaten the whole thing? And you've left some? Like, that's crazy. But we know that it is something that can be achieved. I think just doing it in a step-by-step process to minimize that overwhelm whilst you're addressing those fears can be a really useful way to go about that.
Brilliant. And just as you finish that statement, obviously I can't mute my microphone and mute the dogs barking at the delivery man that's just come at this moment, so apologies if you can hear dogs barking. And hopefully that delivery will just be left on my front step. But yeah, like everything that you said, like I couldn't agree with it more. And such compassion for that client of yours at that first stage where they felt they couldn't have their own, baked goods. And if you're listening to this podcast and you're in a similar boat, like, we have, nothing but compassion for you, and can completely understand your reasons why and why you've kind of got into that trap. But as you said, to kind of slowly reintroduce things and start with what feels the most safe, and then over time gradually reintroduce more things until it becomes the case. Like, absolutely brilliant. What you were talking about as well with these foods, like, it's not a way to live your life. I think that's a big thing that I get a kickback from intuitive eating of, is like, well, it's not possible in the 21st century food environment, because we've got all of these foods that are like highly palatable, very highly caloric. And what would your kickback be to that?
Yeah, I've had that argument a lot as well, that, well, I couldn't possibly just let my body do its own thing because, as you
Mm,
say, there are all these like temptations. And that's certainly a valid concern, in that our food environment does greatly influence our eating behaviors. But when
mhm.
you think about it, you also cultivate your own environment, you know? So, yes, these
Yes.
options are available, but when you are hungry in your home, what do you have available to you there? You know, and we are including, we're not saying don't have these foods at home, because that's not the way we want to go about it either.
No.
But that seems to be a very myopic argument. It doesn't really make that much sense to me. What I think is more important is when it comes to the emotional regulation side of things. That's the thing that's typically underappreciated, because it's when we're feeling vulnerable that those foods become more tempting. You know, if
Yes.
you are full, or comfortably full and feeling pleasant, or just, fine, and you go
Mm.
into a grocery store, you don't want everything, knowing that these
No.
options are available and you can pick
No.
and
No.
choose between them. Now, the one caveat to that is that I would say individuals with obesity may struggle more because they may be more responsive to certain food cues. And that can be very, very difficult to regulate
Mhm.
your appetite because of these changes that have gone on in your body and in your brain that can make you very responsive to food cues. So
Mhm.
that would be a reasonable argument. The other argument against intuitive eating is that it may be a bit privileged, because
Yeah.
those who are in situations of food insecurity or food poverty, who don't have access to foods all of the time, you are more prone to that sort of scavenger, well, let me eat all of this now because I don't know when my next meal is going to be.
Yes.
Trying to help someone like that to eat intuitively is almost like a bit of a slap in the face. But that's not an
Yeah.
argument against intuitive eating. That's an argument against those, why are people in those conditions in the first place,
Yeah.
where food is so scarce and money is so hard to come by. So that's a separate argument. But when it comes to the obesogenic environment, we
Mhm.
do have self-regulation skills. Like we're talking about appetite, but we're also talking about things like emotional regulation, and we
Yeah.
can develop these capacities. So I think that that is a poor argument, and it doesn't necessarily mean that macro tracking is the solution, because these
No.
foods are still out there. So you think having numbers on your phone is going to stop the effects of the obesogenic environment just because you've told yourself you've got to track it? Like, that
No.
doesn't really make sense either. It doesn't help address your appetite. It doesn't help
No.
address the responsiveness to these cues. In fact, it can heighten them. So
Yes.
again, that seems to be a bit of a moot point.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you said that as well, because I want to get into that kind of like I want to get into the long-term research we're now seeing over using kind of tracking apps and things like that, because it, as far as technology goes versus the human existence, it's very, very recent. It's very new still, even though like MyFitnessPal, we might say like, oh, it's been around for more than like 10 years. And it's like, well, that's absolutely zero in the context of the human population. And I love that what you mentioned about, yeah, okay, we have this environment, but you've got self-regulation and you've got emotional regulation, and I love that you can bring around that rational thought to say, well, remember the last time that you went grocery shopping and you were comfortably full, like, were you attracted to all of these foods? Like, no. Whereas if you compare that to going grocery shopping when you're starving, you're like, oh my god, my food bill's 3 times as much. It's like, and you can see that as a great example.
Or
um
grocery shopping when you're in a bad mood. So, oh, we'll
Awful.
buy that thing then.
Yeah, don't do that. And I think that was great as well, Shannon, as you said, of like, I think there's a double-edged sword to emotional eating, right? Because emotional eating, when it's connected, when it's combined with a plethora of other strategies that you have to soothe your emotion, and you've got a good level of diffusion there to be able to notice the emotion, name it correctly, understand how you're feeling, and then go through your toolbox of options to soothe yourself and choose food consciously, is absolutely fine, because you can then do it in a way that like honors your physical and psychological cues. Whereas if it's your only tool, that's when it, as you said, and there's also guilt associated with it, that can kind of compound that feeling of shame and guilt and subjective overeating to make it worse. And that's the kind of binge restrict or emotional eat, guilt restrict go again cycle that we want to move people away from. And yeah, like great of you to bring up that point about intuitive eating kind of being a bit privileged, really, in its instance, but that doesn't mean that it's an argument against that, because for the right population, it could be the exact tool they need to improve their physical and psychological well-being. You use the term people with obesity, and I want to like really dig into this now, because like we chatted about off air of like, okay, you know, why are you trying to lose weight? Is it actually going to improve your health? Are you people who, you know, if you're athletic, healthy population, like what's the goal of like losing weight versus someone who might be inactive and of a certain disposition to certain comorbidities? But what is that threshold? Because like we can't use the BMI, let's be honest. You know, I'm sat here talking to you and I'm technically in an obese BMI, which is annoying because my health insurance costs more. And it's like, you know, because I'm 105 kilos, around there. I don't know. Last time I weighed myself was at the doctor's office a few months ago. Don't own a set of scales anymore for those reasons. But, you know, I'm work out 4 or 5 times a week, muscular. Like, I don't need to lose weight to improve my health. So what is that threshold really for people?
Well, in the research, what they do use is BMI. So we're talking about the classification of overweight and obesity. So BMI of 25 and above. And like you say, it does have its limitations in certain populations, especially athletic populations who will rank sort of higher on the BMI because of their muscle mass as well. So it definitely has its limitations. And this is why I think it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to solely focus on weight. We use that as a proxy measure for health, and we use it as a proxy measure for happiness. And why do we do that? Is it because it's evidence-based, or is it because we've been basically socially conditioned to think that way? And that's why I would really encourage people to closely examine the assumptions that they have, because yes, there are certain risks and impacts on your health with having excess adiposity. Like that's something that I think really does take away from the health at every size, not even health at every size, but the side where they're very anti-diet, anti-fat loss. There's solid grounds of evidence to disassociate our worth from how we look, and there's evidence to suggest that we can improve our health outside of weight loss and with minimal amounts of weight loss, like less than what we would expect for, again, certain populations. So to deny that in some cases excess adiposity can be a risk to health is misinformation, and then detracts from the truth that people do have to speak to, you know? So I think that we can make it clear that there are health benefits, but even for some populations, again, but even with that in mind, that doesn't mean that intentional fat loss is the answer. You know, it's like, well, you just told me excess fat can be problematic for our health. How can intentional fat loss not be the answer to that? It can, because it's not necessarily the most sustainable approach. And we're talking about physical health. Well, we also have to bear in mind someone's psychological well-being. And for many people living in larger bodies, we miss the fact that they can also be experiencing disordered eating or eating disorders, right? Much like you wouldn't tell someone who is struggling with, we think of eating disorders as being affecting underweight people, and that is not the case. 95% are in those, or 95% of people struggling with eating disorders are living in larger bodies. So again, we need to really understand that we have this assumption that any restriction that a quote unquote fat person does must be a good thing, because they're going to lose weight. But that's not necessarily the healthiest thing for them if we're thinking about health in the broader context, but also health. Like that is what it is, not just physical health. So why are we putting physical health on a pedestal above and beyond psychological well-being? And more research is supporting the idea that if we are de-emphasizing the weight and focusing on the behaviors, focusing on the motivation behind that, and using a wide variety of measures to measure success. What is success? How will you know when you're achieving your goal outside of simply seeing a number go down? Well, those are the ways of approaching this that are far more sustainable. And there was even a recent paper. It was looking at weight loss interventions and whether they increase the risk of disordered eating again in certain populations. And I saw a number of fitness professionals using that as evidence that weight loss was safe. And it's like, but if you look closely at the intervention, a lot of them incorporate cognitive behavior therapy, multidisciplinary teams. It's like, yeah, it can be done if you have all of those strategies in place and you're covering those bases, which is not what happens when someone works with a coach. So that's also something very important to bear in mind. So yeah, the paradox being that even if you would benefit from a physical health perspective from losing some excess adiposity, we are still at risk by focusing on intentional fat loss and not achieving that and causing harm in some cases to our psychological well-being. You can lose fat in a way that supports your health and your psychological well-being, but that takes a lot of support from a very skilled professional or a team, and many coaches, again, in the industry are not equipped to do that.
No, and it was really when I was reading your article, which I'll obviously post in the notes of this episode so people can read it in full. When you posted that screenshot of the Westenhofer paper, which was actually even back in '99, that was like, we don't recommend people use like flexible dieting strategies to help people because they will inadvertently become rigid. And it's like, that's amazing, isn't it? Because it's like, that's just what everyone does. And I'll hold my hands up, like I didn't know what I didn't know as a younger practitioner, like I came into the world as someone who was, incredibly fat phobic and had his own body image issues and weight stigma that he'd internalized for his entire life, that was also internalized from diet culture and a thin ideal and all the rest of it, and thought, yeah, okay, my life's mission is to help people lose fat with flexible dieting because then they can eat cereal and see progress. And I was like, thought that I was king of the world. And obviously through, years of study, learning, research, and challenging biases, which is very difficult to do, have kind of come out the other side and almost, I'm probably more on the kind of anti-diet haze camp than ever before. It's similar to what you were just talking about. I don't want to be so far that I become non-evidence based, because that was a big value of mine, was being evidence based. And I appreciate the nuance that you've just gone through there in talking about, like, the limitations of BMI, the fact that there can be some health issues with excess adiposity. I think it could help people listening to this to kind of classify. And I know this is incredibly difficult, but to classify almost what excess adiposity means, because there's a difference between visceral fat and subcutaneous fat, isn't there, in terms of its effects on our health. And I don't want people to like listen to this and think like, oh, well, my BMI is in this range, and although I'm athletic, maybe I do have excess adiposity and still need to like, rigidly try and lose fat, because they might not have heard that everything else that you just said about it may not be the best thing for your overall health. We've got more pillars of health than just that. We've got psychological health and emotional health and all of these other pillars. But I don't know. I think it's just, how do you classify excess adiposity? Is it for people who aren't active but are in larger bodies? Like what do you think that threshold could be? I don't know if you could even give an answer to it.
Well, this is the thing as well for individuals listening. I wouldn't use a sole measure like of body weight or BMI as the only factor that you consider when it comes to trying to improve your health or changing things. Like where is your concern coming from? What makes you think that you may be at risk of, experiencing poor health, and what in your life is currently contributing to that in terms of, when we're looking at behaviors, what would you want to change? If you are currently inactive and think the idea of incorporating movement into your day or week is something that you would benefit from, then that is a choice that you can make independent of body weight or any of these measures. If you're genuinely concerned about your health, go to the doctor, like get some tests done. Don't just step on the scale and think, well, that number doesn't look good, or look at yourself in the mirror and be, maybe I could benefit from losing fat. Like if you're genuinely concerned about your health, get some health checkups, get some blood tests done.
That's what I always say. Yeah. No, get these things tested if you're concerned about health. Yeah. Good point.
Yeah.
Sorry, cut across you. You were still making a point.
Yeah, just then in terms of, well, what would you want to change? Are there aspects of your dietary behaviors that you would like to improve upon? Are there aspects of your stress management that you think you would like to improve upon? What outcome are you looking for? How do you want to feel day to day? And what is not currently contributing to that? And what could potentially contribute to that? Where is the area that you would get the most gain? Again, if you're relatively inactive, well, you can get a whole host of health benefits just from small pockets of movement throughout the day or week. That could be a great place to start, rather than these expectations that we set on ourselves that, well, I have to have, a shredded body. I have to be lifting super heavy in the gym multiple times per week. We've got so many expectations of ourselves. And again, that's not necessarily what the evidence suggests in terms of we undervalue some of the simple things that have a great impact on our well-being, like getting sleep. It's not sexy, but those are the things that do contribute to our health. I think the challenge is then, well, if I am interested in, pursuing a physique or engaging in these behaviors in terms of improving my diet, or I do want to resistance train, how do I do that in a way that is healthy then? Because again, we don't want to pathologize these behaviors, which can be super adaptive, can be really great, for our well-being, but doing it in a way that actually does ensure those outcomes and not at a detriment to our well-being.
Yes. And I think like I love absolutely everything you're saying, and it's why I always really enjoy our podcasts, because I think we share a lot of these sort of thoughts and values, which is great. Because as you just said there, well, what from a behavior standpoint do you actually want to change? Like, what does that look like? And I think that's the most powerful question that you can ask clients, and it's something that I start with in my consultation forms and initial consultation, is that like open-ended question of like, okay, you've rated your your habits as a 3 out of 10, so it's like, what would you need to see to make them like a 5 or a 6? And they're like, they almost pause and they're like, oh my God, I've never been asked that question ever before. Like, I've usually been asked what my goal weight is and whether I've ever tracked calories. And then that was the kind of the end of the questions. And then when they start to think about that, they'll tell me things that we've just chatted about at the very beginning of this episode of like, well, I want to feel like I've got more, a better relationship with food. I want to be able to have these foods and then stop when I'm satisfied. I watched this person be able to leave a restaurant meal, and I've never been able to do that. I've had to always finish it. Or I want to be able to have what I'd like without feeling guilty and then feeling a compulsive need to restrict or overeat or overexercise. And I'm like, brilliant. Well, like now we've got our progress markers. We've got our progress markers, and we can measure your behaviors, and we can do things that are going to help you subjectively and emotionally and physically feel a shit ton better. And so what does it matter if that scale doesn't move? Like, as you said, like chasing leanness by any costs. Like, I'll tell anyone listening now who doesn't know my story, like you'll never get there. Like if you're just chasing a weight number or a figure in the mirror, like there is always more. You'll look at it.
It becomes a moving goalpost. Exactly.
Yeah.
Even if you're successful, the goalpost moves.
I mean, all you need to do is scroll down about 6 posts in my grid to see the kind of like, the 3 stages of my kind of like, and I use BMI as a category here as well, but like, the middle one bit where I was absolutely shredded as lettuce, and it was like still trying, still tracking, still trying to lose fat, still obsessed with that number on the scale. Like it's not enough. Because there were deeper issues going on. And it's so interesting then that you, as we've said at the very beginning of this podcast, well, actually, okay, if you apply unconditional permission to eat and we start looking at emotional eating and more tools of soothing and this idea of getting you to a stage where you are fully connected with your body. Like as you've said, this 5 criteria in your blog, sensitivity to signals of hunger and fullness, self-efficacy to understand what hunger and fullness are. So like learning about those different cues for yourself, giving yourself permission, getting rid of the food police, actually enjoying your food, having a satisfaction, because that's a big thing for people that come to me. They've done so much flexible dieting or eating clean, that really they're like, I don't fucking enjoy my food anymore. Like all I eat is fat-free cottage cheese and baked potatoes and tuna, and then like
Protein
I'll
yogurts.
fucking Arla protein yogurts. Yeah, like I bought shares in Arla so that I could get them delivered to my house. And like all I have is fat-free like maple syrup on my, protein pancakes, and then I finish with, a couple of squares of dark chocolate and say, oh yes, that just hit the spot. And it's like, yeah, but did it though? No, it didn't. And I think, so getting to those 5 stages, as you said there, for people to kind of take this back to wait almost for one sort of final time, for people who are in larger bodies, who are then maybe inactive, who don't have that relationship with food, it's like, okay, let's move there. And then if fat loss happens as a result because you're eating more fruits and vegetables, you're binging less, you're moving more, and you're sleeping better, your stress is lower, and all of these things have improved, and then there's a bit of weight loss that's within that kind of like 5 to 10% range that we see in research, it's like, then that's the improvement in your health that you needed. And I think that's kind of like a good way to put it.
Yeah. And then on the other side of the coin, because I don't want people to come away with the impression that anyone in a larger body could not possibly be active, because that's certainly untrue as well. And on the flip
of
side,
course.
somebody who's in a smaller body isn't necessarily healthy either.
No,
So
exactly.
again, it just doesn't make sense to associate appearance with health, or physical health with total health. So I think that it makes sense why we are led to believe that, because of the pressures that we're under and the images that we're portrayed in the media and so on. But we also have that capacity to examine why we think that's the case, and we can look closely at those beliefs and think, why do I think that I will be happier when I'm leaner? What makes me think that? What's lacking currently in my life now, and how can I directly pursue that? And like you say, if weight loss does occur, cool, great. Maybe that's just a result of you living a life that supports you, and other people may find that their bodies change in other ways, or their bodies don't change at all. And yet they've experienced this like whole eye-opening thing of being able to relax around food and to enjoy their time with their loved ones. And they're not worrying about what they're going to eat at the restaurant and, all these things. So I think it's just that, why do I think that, like, why has flexible dieting become the default? That is the question, because we, as coaches in the industry, it's like the broadest stroke of everyone gets that without consideration. And it's often a case of, well, that was how I learned about food and nutrition, and it worked for me, and it makes sense. And it's like almost a lazy way to coach, because it's quantifiable for you. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily helpful for everyone, so. And as individuals, where have I learned this idea? And, why have I picked this up? And in what ways is it helping? And in what ways is it not helping? Because there may be a mixture of things. So I think these are sort of questions that we can be asking ourselves. And I think the biggest or the most difficult thing that people face is there's not a clear alternative, because it isn't spoken about enough. We speak about it. There are definitely other coaches out there talking about non-tracking methods and all these things. But I think on an individual level, it's still, those are like drops in the ocean, of here's our new diet app and all these things that we hear about. So I think learning how to support yourself in a way that meets your needs allows for the flexibility and the freedom and the satisfaction, which can include tracking. It may not include tracking. Like, these solutions are very difficult to find, in the sense of, I see that people talk about this thing, but it seems unattainable. And where would I even start? I think that's a thing that a lot of people struggle with.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I know what you mean about, like, there's not enough people talking about it like we are, and that's not to like put us on a pedestal or what have you. It's just like, as you said, very much so, coaches, when they first get educated, are educated in a certain way.
Yeah, our education, as you say, that we're trained to think macros.
and also fat loss by any means necessary. you know, you're shown short-term research studies in certain populations that show certain fat loss results, and then you head out into the world that are like, mint, you know, if I just do this, people can lose fat, they can build muscle, and they can hit their goals. And then the issue is that these young coaches who have just this one piece of education that they trust wholeheartedly with their lives because of, you know, all of the research that they're shown in one area rather than all of the other research in another area, you know, they then go into the sea of social media, they get swept up by some business coach that's like, hey, you need to promise people fast results in less time via a certain method, and then that's how
And
you're
don't
going to get
forget to take
clients.
photos for your social proof.
And then just do social proof all the time and make people feel like they need this aesthetic result in order to feel happy, and then that's what gets put out there on repeat, right? And you know, to kind of go back to my earlier statement, I in no way meant to suggest that anybody in a larger body wasn't active, or, you know, because like that's a big part of my, you know, coaching and ideal is this like health at every size and promoting athletics and sport and strength training and
Yeah,
everything
that's the other
in a
thing. Like, what
size.
does it mean to be an athlete, to look like an
Exactly.
athlete? We think
Exactly.
that
We can be
an
in all
athlete
bodies.
must mean massive muscles and shredded. Like, we need to examine those, you know, ideas as well.
Oh, massively. And that was a large part of my body image issues, was because when I was growing up, I played you know, a couple of sports when I was younger. I didn't really kind of get into any until I found rugby. And rugby, it was a kind of case of like, because I was a larger, light bodied boy, you know, massively thrived in rugby because of that, you know, the ability to use my strength and all the rest of it. And from there found the gym and eventually found CrossFit. And it was through CrossFit really, and kind of my own internalized weight stigma, externalized weight stigma in terms of like name calling, things like that, where and then put into a sea of CrossFit where there are certain people that are incredibly lean, to think, well, I need to be lean to be good at the sport. That was the, as well as the like to be happy, that was the kind of
And I
dichotomy
need
in
to
my head.
be great at this sport in order to be worthy.
Oh yeah, massively, like massive chip on my shoulder for various different reasons in terms of like how I needed to find kind of like worthiness and success in something. But that's the kind of like biggest misconception I help people with now, like with my kind of beliefs around kind of CrossFit and functional training have kind of 360'd as well, and kind of coming back into that now and helping people in larger bodies, you know, get better, like get stronger, get fitter, because actually inevitably, because they're so focused on fat loss, their training is shit, you know, like they're not fueling their training sessions, they're not getting any stronger, they're not getting any fitter, and then they're blaming their size. They're like, oh well, if I just got smaller I'd be better at gymnastics. It's like, no, if you actually ate some carbohydrates you'd be better at gymnastics.
Yeah,
So
yeah, completely agree.
well, this has been fun. It's good to kind of get on a show and run with you again, Shannon. And I loved the article, and I loved the kind of like guidelines at the end that you provided people, which, you know, as we've talked about there, like have a non-dichotomous view of food.
Yeah, maybe we can touch on that for a
Yeah,
second, because that's the other sort of limitation with these macro-based approaches, is that
yeah,
even if you're not necessarily like, somehow you found a way not to endorse rigid control, which again, the evidence is not clear on how we would go about that, given
no,
that flexible control and rigid control can often go hand in hand. But
mm-hmm.
even outside of that, macro tracking doesn't give you an opportunity to develop an adaptive relationship with food, in that there are
No,
certain components of eating, such as those listening to those internal cues and having that connection, trusting in your body, you know, getting the satisfaction that can be beneficial to your health. And macro tracking can often be a distraction from these things. It can take us further away from that. So, like you
yes,
say, promoting a non-dichotomous view of foods. I would say that's one thing that a lot of people who are fond of macro tracking, they do report that, well, it allowed me
yeah,
to see that, you know, I can include foods. But again, there's always that condition of as long as it fits, you know, which isn't
yes,
necessarily unconditional. And there are
no,
also other ways to learn that you can include foods without having to track them, you know, so that's sort of, again, a bit of a moot point. But also learning how to appreciate your body is going to be a huge factor in that. And that can be very difficult to do if all of your efforts are focused on actively trying to change that. And this is another thing to touch on, those unexamined assumptions and the way that we've been trained. We've also been trained to assume that if someone wants fat loss, that's a good thing. That means that's what they need. No questions asked. Okay, well, I know how to help you get this goal. Let's do it. And we don't actually examine whether fat loss is appropriate or suitable for a person, and again, why they want it. So I think having that focus on really treating your body with respect and appreciating all the things that it can do for you is also important, because when you value your body, you want to treat it well, which includes moving it and includes fueling it. So that's one thing that is directly related to our eating behaviors, and really having this emphasis on health over shape and weight. Because maybe, as we said, maybe losing fat is in the interest of your health. But if you're focused solely on your weight, you may be focused on losing fat at the expense of your health. Whereas if you focus on the health, then your health's going to be taken care of, and everything else falls into place. So these are also important things, as well as eating at regular intervals. That's something that I think this whole sort of fasting approaches and pushing back your first meal and being scared of eating too many calories early on in the day, because what if I get hungry later and we end up saving our calories and then again overdoing it? Eating at regular intervals is really, really important for most people. So that is something, again, if you're not currently doing, that could be a really great place to start, because that could, if you're not eating at regular intervals, that could be really contributing to why you feel out of control around food. So again, all of these components of an adaptive approach to eating doesn't necessarily have to be intuitive eating, but you don't get many of these benefits when you're solely focused on macros. So really thinking about all of these things that you can strive towards, different goals that you can set, can be helpful in improving your relationship with food, improving your confidence and how you feel in your body, as well as supporting your health.
Massively agree with that, Shannon. It's, as you said, it's so interesting to actually dig deeper between what are you actually helping your client achieve. If they just say like, oh, I want to lose fat, it's like, oh great, yeah, I can help you with that, let's go, rather than actually going through the 5 why process and being like, what's actually going on with this client. And we chatted a lot about emotions and regulation, and it's interesting when you talk with clients about how much self-care and nurturing is actually lacking. They've got shitty boundaries. They don't take enough time to rest. They're constantly on. They're trying so hard to be productive. Like, you mentioned, like, I've got to be good at this to be worthy. It's like, I've got to be good at work and I've got to be good at training, because otherwise, like, what's my identity in life? And they've like sacrificed relationships in order to hit, food and aesthetic goals. And then like now they're feeling the detriments of that, and they're isolated, and you get into all of these other things. And then you're like, yeah, food's not the problem here. Like, it's actually everything else. And if we look at everything else while also helping you come to, unconditional permission and learn how to feel hunger. And as you said, with macro tracking, you're not doing any of those things. It's like, oh, well, the app tells me to eat. Or like, oh yeah, I can have that cake bar because I've got 187 calories left. And that's exactly what that is. Just all of those things of actually teaching people to have the skills beyond calories and the fasting. Like, again, such a brilliant point. Like, the amount of people I've spoken to who have just been like, oh no, I genuinely feel better for only eating between like this really small window, and I feel lighter, and I've lost weight and all the rest of it. And it's like, you kind of think, yeah, you're almost in that honeymoon period before things kind of start to go south again. So the eating at regular intervals, I really enjoyed, and I see such a benefit in people, myself particularly, those who have gone through let's bank calories, let's save calories, and then just having that backfire later on.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly.
Great points. Great. So fantastic article. I'll link it in the show notes for people who have listened to this and want to dig deeper into that, as well as all of the great work that you're doing. Best place to find you, I'm assuming, is still sort of social media as well as that website. Where else might you want to send people? What have you got going on?
Yeah, I'd say check out the website, which is coachshannonbeer.com. I do as well focus a lot on the podcast. So I have a podcast called Consilience, or otherwise, as you say, on Instagram at @shannonbeer_.
Mint. I'll get those in the notes. Shannon, thanks for your time. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, likewise.